Thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wolforst. In the month since President Trump took office for the second time, we've seen multiple legal battles playing out involving his executive orders and policies. From immigration to the economy and attempts to reshape the federal government, Trump has issued more than 100 executive actions so far. But as we said, many of those are currently tied up in the courts. Here with me now to break down where these stand and how this impacts the state of Connecticut Attorney General William Tong. Thank you so much for being here.
Good to see you. Has it only been a month?
I know. It definitely
feels like years.
There's been a lot happening, and that's what I want to start out with. This is our first time checking in since inauguration. We talked beforehand about how your office was preparing, anticipating having to go on the defensive. But as you said, I think it's been an even larger scale than you may have predicted. Before we get into some of the specific cases and policies, what's it been like in your office these past 4 weeks?
It's been 24/7. You know, the president's been flooding the zone, and we're reminded every single day that my job is to protect Connecticut families from some of the biggest risks and threats that we face. And the biggest threat that we're facing right now is Donald Trump. And I don't say this lightly. You know, I don't think what he's doing is trying to make a political statement. I think in many respects, he means to hurt us. He means to hurt Connecticut. So take, for example, you know, his plan for mass deportation. We can talk about immigrants, but what he's really doing is affecting mass layoffs and mass unemployment. I mean, these funding freezes, you know, firing thousands of federal employees, trying to cut the federal government you know, in half, essentially half the FBI's manpower being cut in half with the stroke of a pen. This is doing great damage, not just to the federal government and to people that work for the federal government, but what about the nonprofits here in Connecticut that rely on federal funding? What about state agencies and state employees? What about the businesses that have state contracts and do business with the state of Connecticut? People are losing their jobs, thousands of people, and what that means is whole families, not just individuals, but you know when you lay somebody off, that you affect their entire family.
Sure.
And so people are having trouble paying the rent, paying their mortgages, you know, saving for their kids, and doing all the things they need to do to provide for their families and put food on the table. Yeah. So this is a really dangerous and hard moment for Connecticut, and that's why we're fighting so hard.
And I want to start with birthright citizenship, one of the first ones and one of the ones you really came out strongest against. As of this taping, the Trump administration lost its appeal, the court ruling against lifting the block on the birthright citizenship EO. You know, the court saying this needed a closer review. You know, we know arguments are slated for about June, but this EO has been blocked by 4 separate federal judges so far across the country, each of them saying the policy violates the Constitution. Connecticut is involved in the suit in Massachusetts. Where does it stand right now?
So this is really personal for many of us. Without birthright citizenship, I'm not sitting here right now. I'm an American, not because my parents were American citizens. They weren't when I was born. They were still immigrants. They were not yet citizens. I'm an American citizen by right of my birth down the street in Hartford Hospital. And this is true for so many thousands of people in Connecticut and millions of people across this country. And it's part of the essential character of who we are. And immigrants do so much and contribute so much. There are our teachers, our coworkers, our students. And without immigrants, I say this often now, America runs on 2 things, Dunkin' and immigrant workers, right? Where would we be without immigrants here in Connecticut? The people that founded Electric Boat, Igor Sikorsky, right? We owe such a debt of gratitude to the immigrants that came before us and the immigrants now that power our economy. So I think federal judges understand that. I was in federal court 2 Fridays ago in Boston seeking a preliminary injunction. We got that preliminary injunction. And the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in California, which is one step up, they said, we think you're going to win, states.
Right.
And so we're not going to take away the block that we have on the president's unconstitutional and unlawful action. And here's the key thing. It is so utterly unconstitutional and unlawful what he's trying to do. The 14th Amendment is clear. If you're born on American soil, you're an American, period. Can you imagine if some other president said, okay, you know what? I don't think Americans should be able to own or carry guns, no matter what the Second Amendment says. People would lose their minds. Okay, that is what the president's doing now with birthright citizenship. It's that unlawful. It's that unconstitutional.
And as you said, with that one, so far, judges have agreed with that, and that preliminary injunction still in place. You also joined a group of other attorneys general to challenge the National Institute of Health, NIH, funding cuts for universities and research institutions. We know that put at risk about $13 million in funding for ongoing medical research at UConn. What was the impetus for getting involved in that one, and are there any updates in that suit?
$35 million to UConn alone, many more millions of dollars to Yale and other research institutions here in Connecticut and across this country. Again, another example of his mass unemployment program, his mass layoff program. If you cut $35 million from UConn, people are going to lose their jobs. If you cut the same amount or more from Yale, people are going to lose their jobs. And this is part of course, a larger effort by the federal government and Donald Trump to freeze all federal funding, which is utterly unconstitutional. And I would say, I think on the Monday of the second week, he announced this funding freeze. He did that on Monday night. I sued on Tuesday. We got a temporary restraining order to block him on Friday. And again, this impacts everybody. He means to defund healthcare. He means to defund medical research, research into cancer, autism, the next pandemic, the next vaccine we might need. He needs to defund law enforcement, the FBI. Donald Trump is trying to defund the police right now, and we can't let him do it.
Yeah. You mentioned the federal funding freeze, which I want to get into as well, because obviously, as you said, it's not just specific things like medical research. That federal funding freeze last month would have put a pause on nearly $3 trillion in federal funding, which was already allocated by Congress. You know, you sued, as you mentioned, getting the temporary restraining order. But last week, you were, essentially back in court for the enforcement of that block. Tell me a little bit what's happening there. What's that about?
So we got a court order, and let me just say why. I said before that it's my job to protect the people of this state and Connecticut families and Connecticut children. So no matter who the president is, right? If they do something that hurts people here in Connecticut, it's my job to stand up and stop it and oppose them. This hurts kids, right? The first two things that we saw here in Connecticut was that they closed the payment portal. Basically, you go online, and if you're a state, you submit requests for funding that you're entitled to. And the Medicaid portal was closed. Healthcare, right? Medicine, doctors, nurses, not just for families, but for kids. Head Start was closed. Education, family support for kids. What is the point, right, of going after kids and families? And that's why I say it feels like he means to hurt us. And so that's why I went to federal court to get what is now a very broad order, barring unilateral freezes to federal funding, which he doesn't have the right to do. The president doesn't have the right to say, you know what, Congress exercised its power to spend money, which under the spending clause of the Constitution is Congress's job and prerogative. But you know what, I've decided I don't agree with them, so I'm not gonna spend it. You can't do that. If the president can do whatever he wants, then what do we have? We have unchecked power. Congress becomes not just marginal, but Congress becomes optional. And then our rights become optional. States become optional. And you have an unfettered, unchained executive president. He calls himself, by the way, you saw over the past week, the White House is now putting out graphics and memes that show him wearing a crown. He means to be a dictator. He means to be a king. Now he's boasting that he is, and he's acting like one.
You mentioned the Head Start program. I know as well some of our congressional delegation have been fighting for some of those local medical offices and obviously healthcare agencies. We heard from some of those that even once the block went into place from your lawsuit with other states, some of those programs still didn't have the tap turned back on. They were still having issue accessing the funding. Is your office hearing that as well? Are you getting any sort of calls or notices?
We're hearing it, we're seeing it, we're trying to deal with it, but the damage is being done. Even though there's this legal cat and mouse game being played or whack-a-mole or whatever metaphor you want to use. Sure, we're in court fighting, we're asserting claims, we're getting restraining orders, we're getting injunctions, but at the same time, they're still freezing funding, which is why we had to go back in to say, hey, judge, they're not complying with your court order. Now, you've heard the vice president and others say, well, the president really doesn't have to listen to the courts. And I think the president himself has said in recent days that, I think he said, he who saves his country violates no law.
Yes.
Those are very, very dangerous things to say. It has always been true in this country. Every middle schooler in Connecticut knows that we have a system of checks and balances. And a check on the executive branch, on the president, on their power, a check on the legislature and Congress has always been the courts for more than 200 years. And if you're saying that the president doesn't have to listen to courts and you openly defy court orders, that's called a constitutional crisis. And I'm not being alarmist. That is where we are right now. And that's why we're going so hard 24/7.
Yeah. And I want to get to the last one I want to pull out here. You mentioned, of course, most of what we've been talking about is some of these specific cases have been ruled in favor of the state's attorneys general. One that we're seeing a little bit more iffy is a suit to stop what you and another state attorneys general have called Elon Musk's unconstitutional power grab, arguing Musk has unchecked authority and is violating the Constitution. This past week, though, the judge said the states failed to show they'd suffer imminent irreparable harm. The judge did express some concern over DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, their actions, though. Where does this go from here? Where does that stand right now?
So I refuse to say the word. I say DOGE because it's also a coin, a crypto coin that he's trying to sell, right? So I'm not going to do free marketing for the world's richest man.
Right.
Suffice it to say, actually, there are two cases, and we're doing quite well in the first case against DOGE in New York, in the Southern District. I was in court on that last Friday with Attorney General Tish James. And then in Washington, D.C., I would say that we're still in a strong position with that judge. I think she agrees with us on the merits of the case, and I think she sees it, what everybody sees. Why is an unelected billionaire, the richest guy in the world, running roughshod with an army of hackers and wannabe stormtroopers tearing up the federal government? Why do they have access to your Social Security number and mine? Why do they have access to the central payment system of the U.S. Treasury and know how money gets sent to states, right? Why do they have access, not just read access, which is bad enough that they can see this information, but now they have a read-write access, so technically they can go in and change the programming in the code over systems that pay Social Security benefits, that pay veterans benefits. Now they've hacked into the IRS and the central taxpayer data system. This is lunacy. It's as if the president came down here right now and say, hey, Emma, I like you. You're great. I'm going to put you in the middle of the most secure nuclear weapons research facility in the United States military, and you just go in there and do whatever you want. Would anybody have a problem with that? You know we would. And that's exactly what's happening here. I think there's, a lot of misdirection because the IRS and the Treasury, it's technical and it's financial and it's computer systems. And it may be a little easier to obscure that or to make it confusing, but this is the largest data breach, the largest hack in American history, and it's happening to all of us right now.
Well, Attorney General, thank you so much for checking in about this. Of course, we'll be following as the rest of these play out, and as I'm sure your office will continue working, as you said, around the clock on this. Thank you again.
Thanks, Emma.
We still have more to get to here, though, on The Real Story, as the state legislature works to craft the next 2-year budget, a possible influx of cash for special education this year. We'll tell you how much money and what lawmakers are proposing it be used for ahead.